When I released my last video, there were some very good comments pertaining to whether or not Europe still had gold as a trump card to challenge the petrodollar system, in light of the fact that it is taking so long to repatriate the German gold from the US. This is a very good question to explore, and it can lead us to some very interesting inferences about the future. I often find that to truly understand the position of another person or group, it's good to put myself in the place of that person or group and decide how I would act given the same circumstances and the same information. So let's do that. First, let's examine the statement put out by the Bundesbank in 2012 when they declared their intention to repatriate their gold from New York and Paris. I've bolded the text that I believe to be the most important. The first important item to note is that Germany decided that they would seek to store 50% of their gold in their own vaults by the end of 2020, and would leave the remaining 50% in the vaults of New York and London. The slow pace of the repatriation has been pointed to as evidence that the gold does not exist in the vaults of New York. While the possibility can't be ruled out, there are other possibilities that should be considered. What about the decision to leave half of their gold in the New York and London vaults? What could Germany be seeking to accomplish by leaving half of their gold in international storage? A clue to this is the second bolded statement. They acknowledge that one function of gold is to build trust in the currency domestically, so obviously the gold is very important to Germans and their financial system. They then go on to say that gold is needed for exchange for foreign currencies abroad, and that foreign storage is needed so that these transactions can be carried out quickly. This is very important. Why hasn't anybody focused their attention on this portion of the announcement? It basically says that gold is needed in the US and London for currency settlement. Why would gold be needed for settlement if the US and London banks were not using gold as money? This is critical to understand, everyone. Gold is being used as a principal reserve by the central banks, not because of tradition, as Ben Bernanke said, but because they understand the value of gold. Keep this in the back of your head, because it will be essential to the remainder of this presentation. If the US and the United Kingdom require the use of gold in settlement for international trade, then they must place a high value on it, much higher than they are disclosing to the public. As such, they would be highly reluctant to part with it. They'd loan it, yes, but let it leave their control? It's unlikely without a very good reason to do so. So there is a train of thought amongst the precious metals bulls that believe that empty vaults would be bullish for metals prices. I don't dispute that, but have you considered that it would be more bullish for the real value of the metals if they've been tightly held in the vaults for all of these years, with central banks using them as power money this whole time? Imagine what would happen if the paradigm changed and the central bankers were incented to fully value gold for all of the world to see. That, to me, is more bullish, as well as the more likely scenario. But let's take this further. Here, I've summarized what we know about the various gold reserves of various countries. In the upper left, we have what the US claims to hold. It claims that of the over 8,000 tons it has, that only 400 or so are stored in the vaults of New York. The rest of it is in deep storage, or at the US Mint as working stock. Given that the dollar is the world reserve currency, it is not necessary for the US to store gold abroad, or even have much on storage with the Fed, ready to be mobilized quickly. That's one advantage to having a currency that everyone else holds as a reserve. You can keep your gold at home. This is one of the reasons why Germany can pull its gold from France. Since the euro is used for European Monetary Union settlement, there is no reason for Germany to need to have some gold on deposit with France. On the right, we see that the gold reserves claimed by Europe. Notice that Europe at over 10,000 tons has more gold on its books than the US. Of these, Germany has about 3,400 tons. Of this, a little less than a third is stored in Frankfurt, about a tenth is stored in Paris, a tenth is stored in London, and the rest, a little less than half, is stored in New York. So the question everyone is raising is whether or not that half of Germany's gold is safe. So let's look at the lower left of this slide, which summarizes the gold that New York claims to hold. There are about 6,700 tons of gold in total. We know that about 25% of this is Germany's. There's a small amount of US gold. The IMF requires by its charter to keep at least 50% of its gold in the US, so this is likely also stored at the New York Fed. And then there is the gold stored by other countries, many of them European. Germany and the rest of the EU have made it abundantly clear that their goal is to diminish the role of US currency for world trade. This was one of the main reasons for the introduction of the euro. The US is absolutely aware that competition is growing in the world trade arena. Let's play some scenarios with the New York Fed gold and US deep storage gold to see what the players are likely to be doing. Let's take as a baseline scenario the case that the gold actually does exist at the New York Fed, as stated, and that the German gold requested will be shipped to Frankfurt by the end of 2020. In this case, the most likely reason for the long time required to transfer all of the gold is that it has been leased out and it will take some time for the leases to expire, but more on that later. In this scenario, you can see that the US accounts for 37% of the gold of the group discussed on the previous slide. All of the European Monetary Union has about half, of which Germany is a little less than a third of that. In the event of a system reset where the petrodollar is replaced by another currency where gold plays a major role, the US would have a greatly reduced role relative to where they are now, and a slightly smaller role than the European Union. This would be a fairly comfortable position for Germany and the rest of the European Monetary Union. It is also a fairly comfortable position for the US. The US might not like it as much as the current system, but the US would still have a fairly big chair at the table. Here is the opposite end of the spectrum. It is the doomsday scenario, where the US does not have the gold that it claims to have in deep storage. The New York Fed also does not have the gold that it claims to have. Suppose Germany was to force the issue and demand all of their gold back right now. They're certainly entitled to do so, provided, of course, that it hasn't been leased out by Germany itself. In this scenario, the other countries would demand that the US make good on the gold owed, but there would be no gold to be returned. So in this case, the US reveals to the world that it has no gold, or greatly less than stated. The IMF would lose half or all of the gold that it thought it had. Germany and the rest of the European Union would have less gold than they thought they had, but they would basically have all of the power. The US would have no power at all. This would certainly align with the interests of a powerful Europe. So if it really was the case, then why would Germany not force the issue by not only demanding that their gold be returned immediately, but demanding that all of it be returned? Further, why would the US put themselves in this position? They know that gold is the trump card. They know that the dollar will likely be replaced with something else eventually. Why would they give up this trump card? While this scenario must be admitted as one of the possibilities, I think the one at the top is far more likely. So let's consider another scenario where there is no gold at the New York Fed to be returned to Germany. If that's the case, then there's probably no gold to be returned to anyone. Now remember, the dollar is issued by the Fed, and so if the Fed defaults on its obligations, then the dollar will either completely vaporize or will decrease in value tremendously. Gold as the trump card would have to be used if the US was to retain any power. In order for the US to participate in world trade with legitimate currency going forward, the US would need to defend the dollar by making good on all of the claims on gold with the Fed. In this scenario, the European Monetary Union would hold almost 75% of the gold here. The US would only hold 7%. In other words, the US would have less power on the world stage than the country of Italy. Certainly, this is a position that the US does not want to be in. It is also a position that Germany would want to reveal to the world as quickly as possible if it was true. So again, I'm inclined to believe the scenario shown at the top, where the delays in delivery are truly because of gold leasing and not because of lack of existence of the gold. Let's assume for the moment, based upon the fact that the central banks are using gold for international settlement and therefore value gold very highly, based upon the fact that Germany has engaged in gold leasing in the past, based upon Germany's patience in the matter, based upon the return of at least some of Germany's gold, based upon the interests of the United States, and based upon some audits that state that the gold is there, that it actually is, and simply encumbered by gold lease agreements. This would mean that by the end of the year 2020, the allocation of gold between the major players here would be along the lines of what's shown at the top of on this pie chart. Put yourself in Germany's shoes. If the goal is to usher in an era where gold plays a much greater role in world trade, how do you play this game? Remember, the one thing that has allowed the dollar to dominate world trade for as long as it has after the end of Bretton Woods was the ability for the US to keep its value strong in gold. It did this by working with bullion banks to arrange gold loans to mining companies, who then sold production forward for a guaranteed profit. The backing of the US Fed and other central banks gave the gold futures contracts credibility as a means to obtain gold at low prices. The ability of the oil states to obtain gold in this manner in exchange for their dollars was what maintained their support for the support of the oil states for the dollar. I outlined this mechanism in the two videos entitled When Gold and Silver Go into Hiding and The Gold Must Flow. So if you're a major participant in this game, as Germany is, and you recognize this as the system that serves to maintain the power of the dollar, besides introducing another major world currency, how do you go about weakening the dollar? You would basically attack this system on the lower left. The European Monetary Union controls about 45% of the world's official gold reserves. You have control over a major portion of that gold that backs the loans made by the bullion banks. You also have bullion banks that play a major role in this game, Deutsche Bank for example. Let's take a look at some of the things that Germany and the rest of the European Monetary Union have done over the years to weaken this system. In 1999, shortly after the formal release of the euro as a world currency, the central banks, who were heavily involved in the project, issued the following statement. It was a proclamation that the central banks acknowledged that gold played an important role in monetary reserves. It limited physical sales to those that had already been agreed upon, no more than 2,000 tons over 5 years. It also signaled that gold leases would not be increased. This last statement was a shot across the bow that the mechanism that maintained the dollar's strength would not enjoy increased European support. In 2004, this agreement was renewed. All of the major elements remained in place, with only a small change to the amount of gold that would be sold. And then, in 2009, this agreement was again renewed. This time, there was a major change. Do you notice anything missing here that was on the previous two agreements? Conspicuously absent was any mention of gold leasing. So the major question is, why? Why did this agreement omit it? What was so special about 2009? Plus, another question that needs to be asked is what will the agreement look like this year when the 2009 agreement expires? Now, most of the gold lease, gold loan action happens on the LBMA, where contracts are far less visible. Nonetheless, we can see the effects of the 2009 announcement on the COMEX. Notice that shortly after the announcement, the number of commercial short and long positions increased on the COMEX greatly. The commercial shorts are the mining interests. Notice that the forward sales of gold nearly doubled over the next couple years. The claims on that gold also doubled. It's not clear what happened in London on the LBMA, but if the COMEX is any indication, then the machine that supports the petrodollar kicked into high gear. Then, in 2011, we started seeing some significant downward pressure on the gold market. The price of gold decreased substantially to the point where the profit margins of the mines started seeing significant pressure. This took away any incentive for the mines to sell forward more future production. So, as the old short contracts expired, they weren't replaced by additional ones. At the same time, the sudden decline in the price of gold increased the desire of various parties to take delivery of the gold that they could and to try to obtain more. The big question now is, will the physical gold be able to flow to where it needs to go? What if it can't? If it doesn't, then the paper gold derivative market will cease to exist, because those who were using it to obtain real physical gold will no longer be able to do so. The oil states and China will have no more incentive to bid for dollars because they won't be able to use the dollars to obtain cheap gold. It is in this scenario that physical gold will reveal its true value to the world. Thus, gold will reassert itself in its dominance in international trade, and the European Union will have achieved its goal. So now the real question is, who has been monkeying around with the futures market over the past couple of years? I have my theories based upon the motivations of the various players. It certainly is suspicious that Germany's bullion bank Deutsche Bank decided to exit the London gold fix recently. It will be very interesting to see what the Central Bank Gold Agreement of 2014 will say.